The train had not come yet, and she stood at the edge of the platform watching the tracks run straight until they became nothing, which was a thing prairie tracks did without apology. It was the third year she'd stood here waiting for the mail run, and she knew by now the sound of the engine before she could see it. A low vibration the boards took up first, rising through the soles of her boots and into her knees the way weather moved into old injuries. Behind her, the boy had gone to look at the freight wagons stacked along the depot wall. Silas did this every time. He was 7 now, lean and serious, with his father's wide forehead and her own habit of going quiet when something required thinking. She let him go. The platform was short and straight, and there was nowhere to get lost that she couldn't find him from where she stood. 3 years ago, she had been the one stepping off that train. She'd come from Guelph in October, which her sister had called a foolish time to travel west, and her sister had not been wrong. The CPR car was cold from Winnipeg onward, the kind of cold that found every gap in a coat seam and made itself at home there. She'd sat with Silas wedged against her side, the boy 4 years old then, and largely indifferent to discomfort the way small children are, and she'd held his hat down over his ears for 6 hours and read the letter for the last time before she folded it back into her pocket for good. 3 lines. She had memorized them on the platform in Guelph before she'd even boarded. I need a woman who can work, one who won't ask the prairie to be something it isn't. I don't need a pretty wife, I need one who's steady. She'd read it 100 times looking for something it didn't say, some warmth folded between the lines the way her sister's letters always had warmth folded in, the kind you had to unfold to find. There was nothing like that in his 3 lines. They were as plain as a surveyor's mark. She had respected that in the end more than she'd have respected prettiness. He was waiting at the station. She knew it was him before he moved toward her because he was the only man standing still, and men who are waiting for something they aren't certain of tend to stand very still. He was broad across the shoulders, not tall, with a jaw that had been broken once and set slightly wrong, and he looked at her the way a person looks at a sum they're doing in their head. Not unkind, just careful. She had 2 bags. She was carrying both, the boy on her hip, the larger bag in her right hand. She did not set them down when she reached him. He looked at the bags, then at the boy, then at her. "You'll be her," he said. It wasn't a question, so she didn't treat it like one. Yes. He reached for the larger bag. She let him have it. He turned toward the wagon without further ceremony, and she followed him because that was what she'd come here to do. He said, halfway to the wagon without looking back, "You wrote that you had a child." "I did." "He looks like yours." "He is." He nodded once, the way a man nods when the ledger balances. It took 3 hours to reach the homestead by wagon. The prairie opened around them as the town fell away, flat and enormous under a sky so wide, it made her feel she'd misunderstood the word sky until this moment. She counted fence posts the way she counted things when she needed her hands to stop fidgeting. He drove without talking. The boy fell asleep against her arm. "Your wife," she said once because it wanted saying to get it out of the way. "When did she pass?" "February, 2 years back." "I'm sorry." He looked at the horse's ears. It was a hard winter. That was the whole of it. She filed it and did not bring it out again. The first week, she learned the shape of the house by doing the things it needed done. The pantry ran short on salt. She noted it. The stovepipe drew to the left when the north wind came up. She learned to compensate. The well rope had been spliced badly at the midpoint and was fraying on one side. She wrapped it in a strip of flannel until it could be properly replaced and left a note on the work table that said only, "Rope at the well, fray and me, midpoint." He read it that evening, standing by the lamp, and said nothing. The next morning the rope was new. She did not say anything about that either. It was how the house seemed to work. Silas took to the farm the way 4-year-olds take to things that are large and interesting and not particularly dangerous, with a totality that left her sometimes standing in the yard, watching him chase the barn cat, not quite believing she had done the right thing and not quite believing she hadn't. The right things and the not right things looked very similar out here. That was something she hadn't expected. The first Sunday, she baked bread. Not because it was Sunday, but because the house was out of it. And she'd found the flour in the cold room, and she knew how to make bread, and it seemed a reasonable use of a morning. She was pulling the second loaf out when he came in from checking the stock. He looked at the loaves on the rack the way he'd looked at her at the station. "You bake," he said. "Most things, not pastry. I've never been patient enough for pastry." Something moved in his face too small to name. He went to the basin and washed his hands and sat down at the table without being asked, and she cut him a slice and set it in front of him, and they ate in a silence that was not yet comfortable, but was no longer entirely uncertain either. November came down hard, the way she'd been told November would, and had not believed until she felt it. The temperature dropped in a single day. The well froze to a depth she hadn't thought possible, and she learned to start the kitchen fire before first light, when the dark was still absolute, and the only sound was the wind finding the gap under the east door that she hadn't yet managed to seal. Her hands cracked in the cold. They always did in winter. She had her mother's hands wide across the knuckles, the kind that worked well but did not bear cold graciously. She wrapped them in strips from an old pillowcase and kept on. There was no point in drawing attention to a thing that couldn't be changed, and the cold wasn't changing. One morning she came down to find a pair of gloves on the work table. Men's work gloves, brown leather, well made. She picked one up. It was too small to be his. His hands were larger than hers, which she'd registered the first week without particularly meaning to. She turned it over. The palm had been restitched with a heavier thread, the fit cut wider through the hand than gloves usually ran, shaped for someone whose hands sat between women's small and men's standard and were comfortably neither. She set the glove back down. She put both of them on. They fit. She stood in the kitchen with the fire ticking behind her and looked at her own hands for a long moment, not quite able to sort out what she was feeling, which was itself unusual. She generally knew what she was feeling with reasonable accuracy. She went out to start the morning work, the gloves on. He was in the barn when she came through with the water bucket. He glanced at her hands, registered the gloves, and looked away, which was as close to a conversation as he seemed able to manage before 8 in the morning. She was beginning to understand that this was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference, managed sideways. She thought of the letter. "I need one who's steady." She was beginning to understand what he'd actually meant by that. January was the month she almost left. Silas took sick the way children do on the prairie in winter. Fast and without warning, the fever climbing in a single afternoon from nothing to the kind of high that made her stop measuring it and start calculating what she could do and in what order. The roads were drifted closed. He was in the barn when she got the boy settled and went to find him. He came in, looked at the boy, and went back out without a word. She heard the horses. He was readying the sleigh. She went back to the boy and did what she could with what she had, and when she next looked out the window, the sleigh was gone. He came back in 4 hours with the doctor from Dunfield, a small man named Gideon Pratt who smelled of wood smoke and carbolic and who worked without asking unnecessary questions, which she appreciated enormously in that moment. By midnight, the fever had broken. She sat with the boy until he slept properly, and then she sat in the kitchen alone with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, and she thought, not for the first time that winter, but for the first time with real weight behind it, I could go back. She had a sister in Guelph. She had a life she'd left, small but hers. She could wire for the passage money, and her sister would send it, and her sister had said from the beginning that she was making a mistake. She got up and found paper and wrote the letter. She wrote it properly, addressed it, and sealed it, and set it on the table. Then she went to bed. In the morning she came downstairs, and the letter was where she'd left it. And he was at the table with his coffee, working through the farm receipts the way he did most mornings. And he said, without looking up, "Pratt says the boy should have honey in his tea for the cough. Better than any tonic." On the table beside the letter there was a jar of honey, dark amber, from the Mennonite farm 2 concessions east that he'd mentioned once, in passing months ago. He went on reading the receipts. She stood for a moment, with her hand resting on the back of a chair, looking at the jar and the letter and his downturned face. She made a decision that she did not put into words, because she wasn't ready to put it into words yet. She took the letter and held it over the open stove door and let it go. He didn't watch her do it. He was still looking at the receipts. "I'll put honey in his tea," she said. "Good," he said. Spring came late, as springs do in that part of the country. The ground gave up its frost slowly, reluctantly, the way old houses give up their cold, one room at a time from the surface down. She planted the kitchen garden a week later than she'd meant to. The north pasture flooded when the snowmelt came faster than the drainage ditches could carry it, and she spent 3 days in March in water to her boot tops, pulling field tiles clear and resetting them, work that left her wrists aching and her face burned raw by the wind. He'd been in town those 3 days for the co-op meeting, the annual one that required his presence. She'd known it was coming. She'd managed. When he came back and walked the north pasture fence line and saw the drainage work, he stood a long moment looking at it. "That's properly done," he said. The near tiles were backed up. I reseeded 4 of them. He looked at the length of the repaired ditch bank, the new grade she'd cut around the lowest corner to redirect the overflow. He looked at all of it with the particular expression he had when something had exceeded what he'd calculated it would be. "You did this alone." "Silas handed me tiles when I needed them." She paused. "He's useful." He almost smiled. She was learning to see the almost smiles, which were as close as he came to laughing outright. That night, he fixed the east door gap she'd been packing with rags since November. She heard him working after supper, measured and unhurried, and when she came through the next morning, the draft was gone, and the door swung clean, and there was no sawdust, no evidence, only the absence of the thing that had been wrong. She stood in the doorway a moment with her coffee and felt the absence like a change in pressure. She had stopped writing letters to her sister about what she was feeling. There wasn't language for it that fit in a letter. It wasn't happiness exactly, not the loud kind. It was more like a door that had been fixed. The thing that used to be wrong was no longer wrong, and that was its own kind of fact. The inspector from Winnipeg came on a Wednesday in late June. She'd known he was coming because the letter from the Dominion Lands office had arrived 3 weeks before, and she'd read it aloud at breakfast and set it on the mantel and not spoken of it again, because there was no point in speaking of a thing that wasn't here yet. He'd done the same. They operated on a shared economy of attention. Nothing spent before it was needed. The inspector was a man named Mr. Pemberton. He arrived in a hired rig from Dunfield, dressed for Winnipeg rather than the Pembina Valley in June, his collar already darkening with sweat before he'd crossed the yard. He had a leather satchel and the expression of a man who had made up his mind before arriving and was here only to collect evidence for the conclusion he'd already drawn. She was on her knees in the kitchen garden when he pulled in. She finished the row she was weeding before she stood. There was no point in leaving a row half done for the sake of appearances. He looked at the garden. He looked at the barn, the new lean-to addition on the south side, the repaired fence running straight to the tree line, the hay stacked dry and square under the new canvas. He looked at her. He looked at her the way men look at things they weren't told about and aren't sure how to account for. She wiped her hands on her apron and did not offer a greeting that would require him to answer it. He went inside to find the man he'd come to see. She went back to her row. She heard them on the porch eventually, Pemberton's voice doing most of the work, reading figures from his documents, commenting on the drainage works, the livestock count, the winter yield. He had a way of phrasing things that made every improvement sound like it required explanation. Surprised to find the records this orderly. Surprised the acreage is so well broken. A place like this far from town, you'd expect a certain, and then his voice dropped and she couldn't make out the rest. She heard the answer, though. He had a quiet voice. He always spoke as though volume were something to be spent wisely. But the porch was not far, and the afternoon was still. "The accounts are hers," he said. "She keeps them." A silence, Pemberton recalibrating. "And the drainage work, the north pasture, that was." Her work, I was in town. Another silence. Well, Pemberton clearing his throat, starting over. I'll say plainly, coming out here, holding this isolated, run on this budget, I expected to find certain deficiencies. The kind of place where a man is stretched thin and there's no one steadying things behind him too. She's not behind me. The sentence sat in the afternoon air. She kept her hands moving in the soil, feeling the words settle around her like a change in weather. She runs alongside, has done from the first. Pemberton cleared his throat again. The sound of papers being shuffled. Well, yes, I can see that. She heard boots on the porch steps. She knew them. And then the sound of him moving to the fence rail, the place he stood in the mornings when he wanted to think without interruption. She did not look up. She was not ready to look up. After a moment, she heard him cross the yard toward her. She registered his boots, stopping at the edge of the garden bed. He stood there, not saying anything, the way he stood when something had been settled. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He had her gloves in his hand. She'd left them on the fence post that morning. He held them out. Ground's wet still, he said. Hands'll crack again. She took them. She pulled them on. He stood and watched her do it, which was unusual. He rarely watched directly the things he cared about. And then he turned and went back to the porch to finish whatever else Pemberton required of him. She looked at her gloved hands, then at the row of weeds she still had to finish. She went back to work. Pemberton left before supper. She heard the hired rig going down the lane, the wheels finding every rut in the drying mud, and she kept the stove going and didn't watch it go. He came in at dusk the way he always came in, boots on the mat, hat on the peg, the paws at the basin, and sat down at the table. She put his plate in front of him. She put her own across from it. Silas had already eaten and been sent to wash up, a negotiation that had taken 2 full years to arrive at and was not entirely smooth yet. They ate. After a while, she said, "The renewal, is it settled?" "It's settled." She nodded. Pemberton said. He stopped, cut another piece, started again. He said the records were the best he'd seen from a homestead this size. "I keep good records." "I know you do." He said it without looking up. "I've known that since the first winter." She looked at the lamp, at the way the light moved, at the way it caught the grain of the table, which she had scrubbed 600 times, and which she knew the way you know the face of something you have paid careful attention to. He asked, he said, still not looking up. "How we managed out here alone," he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him we weren't alone." He set his fork down. He looked at her then, the way he looked at the fence line in the evenings, the way he looked at weather coming across the flats, steady, unhurried, as if the looking were a thing he intended to finish properly. "I told him I had exactly what I asked for." She looked back at him. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and they both understood that. And neither of them was a person who spent words on things that were already known. Outside, a nighthawk called once over the north pasture. Through the wall came the low murmur of Silas talking to himself the way he did before sleep, a sound that had become, over 3 years, one of the sounds the house made when everything was running as it should. She got up and cleared the plates. He poured himself the last of the coffee. She left the pot on the table instead of back on the stove because there was enough left in it for another cup, and she was not yet ready to go in. She stood at the window and looked at the yard going dark, the fence line losing itself in the dusk, the garden bed she'd weeded that afternoon already looking as though it had always been tended. The prairie did that, absorbed the work fast, made it look like it had always been done. You had to keep doing it to keep it true. He came to stand beside her. Not close, not the way people stand when they mean something particular by it, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which in a house that fought the cold for 6 months of the year carried its own particular weight. "Pemberton will be back in 5 years," he said. "Let him come." He was quiet a moment. "You'll want to expand the garden," he said. "Past the fence line, there's room on the east side." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant, that he was talking about 5 years from now, about the fence line, about what she'd want. "I'll need more steaks," she said. "I'll get them in town Thursday." She nodded. Outside, the last light went from the sky the way it did on the prairie, all at once and completely, without lingering. The fence posts went from gray to black to nothing at all, and the nighthawk called again, farther east now, and behind them Silas went quiet. She thought about the letter she'd written in January and held over the open stove. She thought about the gloves appearing on the work table. On a morning she hadn't said a word about her hands. She thought about a honey jar set beside something it couldn't fix but didn't ignore. She thought about a fence built post by post into ground that had not asked to be changed, and how by spring it looked as though it had always stood exactly where it was. "I'll see to the dishes," she said. "I'll check the barn." She turned from the window. He went for his coat. At the door he paused the way he always paused. One breath, one beat, and she heard the door open and close quiet behind him, and his boots crossed the yard in the dark toward the barn, the way they did every evening without fail, and she went to the basin and started the water, and the house held its warmth around her the way it had learned to, against whatever came in off the flats through the night. She did not need to look out the window to know the fence posts were still standing. She already knew.